Welcome to the Westwood Human Rights Roundtable, a deep dive into the work of the Human Rights Task Force. I'm your co-host, Melinda Garfield.
And I'm Danielle Sutton.
And we are so happy to be joined by Rabbi Micah Citrin of the Westwood Temple Beth David congregation. Welcome.
Thank you.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about how you got involved and when you were appointed to the task force?
Certainly. Thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, I'm co-rabbi at Temple Beth David here in Westwood, along with my wife, Rabbi Karen Citrin. And we've been here for about 6 years. Temple Beth David is a Reform synagogue. The Reform movement is on the progressive end of the Jewish religious spectrum. And in addition to serving Westwood, we also serve Medfield, Norwood, Dover, parts of Dover, Dedham, so surrounding towns. I think I was invited to participate on the task force about a year ago. And one of our members, Connie Rizzoli, has been intimately involved in the task force. And, between both Connie and, of course, you, Melinda, as well, thought that perhaps perspective of a rabbi could be helpful. And there's a long history of the Jewish community in Westwood as part of Westwood's tapestry of diversity. So feel very honored to participate.
Sure. We know that you have also been involved with the Interfaith Council. Can you explain what that is? When did it start? And what do you do?
Sure. Yeah, so the Interfaith Council is something really special that we were introduced to when we arrived in Westwood 6 years ago. It's really the group of clergy in Westwood, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, and it's been an opportunity for dialogue, also for cooperation between our communities. So, for example, the interfaith Thanksgiving observance that has been held. Other ways for cooperation, Temple Beth David hosts an interfaith mini walk for hunger that seeks to bring people together of different faith backgrounds and do good for the world to help make sure that people are fed and have enough to eat. And it's interesting, when we arrived 6 years ago, Karen and I were really the new clergy in town, with some long-standing clergy members at First Baptist and First Parish and St. John's, and certainly St. Denis and St. Margaret Mary's. And in that time, colleagues have retired, and we've been fortunate enough to welcome new colleagues. But it's, in addition to being a source of collegiality among clergy, it helps to make sure that the people of different faiths are talking to one another and sharing challenges, and also showing up for one another. Certainly, in recent years, when there's been some anti-Semitic graffiti, for example, it was our colleagues in the interfaith community who really rallied and said, this isn't just a Jewish problem. Any kind of hate is a Westwood problem. It's a problem for anybody who cares about the dignity of other human beings. So it's been just a wonderful subset of community within Westwood.
Would you say that the Interfaith Council gets reports of hate? Is this a place where people do go to report things?
I don't know if we've gotten any kind of reports outside of what everyone else hears or comes up with in terms of community. But Danielle, as you were saying, we have a connection to our own people, as it were, and if when things come up, there can be a unified message. Certainly our religious traditions are different. We come at things from a different perspective, but what is shared is a reverence for for people, for humanity, for the notion that we're all created in God's image and have a divine spark in us. And that's something that, at least in terms of the faith communities here in Westwood, that is the common denominator. I know that just feeling mutual support, being there to support each other's communities is really important. And we've certainly felt that, at least, in Westwood, we don't have a mosque in town. That would be another significant minority community, though I know that there are Muslims who live in Westwood. But from a religious point of view, we're kind of the visible minority house of worship. So whether it was the terrorist attacks at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh a number of years ago, just this year with Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, getting a letter or getting an email that we can then share with our community from one of the pastors of the Christian community, it means a lot. We received just a lovely letter from one of our colleagues in town that we were then able, actually on one of our services, to share with the congregation, just knowing that we weren't alone, that even though something that happened 1,000 miles away in Texas did have an effect on our members, because, well, Karen and I knew the rabbi, certainly as colleagues, and it was clear that he had also chosen that place because it was a Jewish place of worship, with sort of all of the twisted prejudice that he brought with it, thinking that he could somehow influence U.S. policy on a federal prisoner by taking Jews hostage, sort of based on old anti-Semitic tropes of Jews pulling the levers of power. So to just have, hey, we're with you, that means a lot. And I think that goes sort of further to the idea of the Human Rights Task Force, which is to expand our circle of concern. That I'm not just concerned with my people or my community, but when I see other people, or when we see other people treated in a manner that is less than dignified, to say, well, we can speak up. And it's not just speaking out against, but it's speaking in support of, and those small things really make a difference and create connection.
Absolutely. I remember, so I started working in Westwood back in 2004, and I remember driving to the intersection of Nahatan and Clapboard Tree and seeing, it's where the Greek Orthodox Church is now, and where they always have sold pumpkins, like out there. And there was a sign that said, we maybe we wish a happy new year, or we wish the best to our friends at Temple Beth David.
First Parish.
First Parish.
First Parish does that, yeah.
Yeah.
And they do that, and I remember seeing that for the first time, too, and saying, hey, what a thoughtful thing. Because oftentimes, part of being in a different tradition is that you mark time differently. So for us, our big holidays are the fall, though sort of the larger culture thinks it's Hanukkah in December, which is really actually a minor holiday, but it is in close proximity to a major holiday for Christianity. So to see the acknowledgement in the fall season of our holiest time of the year is it's a small thing that has really big implications and meaningful results.
Yeah, I think it struck me for two reasons. The first was that it's one thing to join in a time of loss or a time of concern. It's another thing to join in celebration. I think that, and all of those are important, but that felt meaningful to just, acknowledge the celebration of a minority faith group, as one of the non-minority faith groups. And then I think the other part, so years after that, there was the Roy London Humanitarian Award. You guys might be familiar with that. And they told the story, someone from Roy London's life told the story that he was a member of the First Parish congregation. And he had basically, I think, when did Temple Beth David open its doors in Westwood?
1961.
So he when Temple Beth David came in, he handcrafted the first sign. I don't know if it's the same sign, but he handcrafted the first sign and presented it, to the leadership at First Parish, and just said, we need to kind of celebrate and welcome our neighbors. And I always think about that like one person, right? Like just doing what was right. And now that's something that feels really symbolic. As a stranger to Westwood, I saw that and felt very good about my choice to be here, in the community. It's just one small anecdote, but it always makes me think of that idea of how the faiths can, celebrate each other and really model that for the community.
You had mentioned, the role of the Interfaith Council when, let's say, there were swastikas found in the high school, which seems oddly to be a reoccurring issue throughout the years. Like, it's not just a 2022 issue. This is a constant issue of people putting swastikas. You hear it all the time throughout the generations. I know I was speaking with one of the older congregants within Temple Beth David, and she was saying that when her child was there, which must have been with the 90s probably when her child was there, that this was an issue then too. How are the rabbis either used or called upon by the community to, I guess, make heads or tails of what's happening with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've been pleased to be invited to help engage in those conversations. So the first time this came up during our tenure is when Sean Bevan was principal at Westwood High School, and he immediately reached out to us. And I should say, these incidents have happened in neighboring towns where we have congregants in those school districts, and either superintendents or principals have been very good to reach out. Sean Bevan started a whole initiative engaging students and faculty to in some ways mirroring or preceding the work of the Human Rights Task Force to make more explicit caring about the dignity of all people in the school community, at least a priority. The other thing that he did was he brought in a Holocaust survivor to speak at the high school, and I believe the 8th graders were also invited to attend. And I think that was important for two reasons. One reason is that, of course, that Nazi symbol represents one of the most terrible genocides in the human experience, where Jews were the primary target, not the only target, but the primary target, where 60% of world Jewry and nearly all of European Jewry was annihilated, men, women, children, indiscriminate. And so that brought that history to bear. But the thing that our speaker did so well is that the context was an attack on Jews because they were Jews, employing industrial mass murder. But the Nazi philosophy of some humans being superior to other humans is not just about Jews. We've seen that in multiple genocides across the world, and is a really toxic belief, an evil philosophy. And so what she said was, she empowered the students to say, you have an opportunity to make a difference in standing against that kind of belief, in how you speak to people, in the type of interactions that you have with people, and how you help to create a community that's one of kindness and care rather than division and cruelty. And she said, that's a human responsibility. And that was something that was really heartening to see, to talk to the kids on a general human level, because we're all different. We all have the potential to be hated by another for something that is just who we are. The other thing I always find interesting, and why I think it's an important thing to combat, is think about the number of American soldiers who died trying to defeat that symbol, the Nazi symbol, and that ideology. And in fact, at one of the times we talk about our country being divided right now, nothing bringing us together, if you look at history, that was a time when the country was exceedingly united to fight fascism, to fight Nazi ideology. So I also think to draw that symbol is an affront to those students' grandparents or great-grandparents who fought in that war. And that's something to keep in mind too.
Yeah. In what ways do you see that we can make improvements in our community? I know we, as a Human Rights Task Force, we've been jotting things down, but particularly, what did you add to the story?
So I think one of the best things that I think the Human Rights Task Force is doing is simply existing. In other words, taking some of the things that we talk about as being implicit and making them explicit, and certainly involving our town government with the statement of support. I think that that's really important. From the Jewish community point of view, and we have, there's not an insignificant minority. The fact that the school district was open to acknowledging the Jewish high holiday season, both for students and for Jewish teachers, and to take that time off was a really important recognition for our community.
And that doesn't happen everywhere. I mean, I grew up in a town in Connecticut that did not have the Jewish high holidays off. And it's almost few and far between, to be honest.
I think so. And at the same time, there are many towns within the greater Boston area, because this does tend to be a larger Jewish communal area when you think about the larger Jewish population centers. You're talking LA, New York, Boston too, Chicago. So it was an acknowledgement that it was an acknowledgement of inclusion, and just like we take time off for the dominant culture around the Christmas season to recognize that being a time of family and friends, it really helped us feel like part of the community and embraced by the community.
Right.
I guess the other thing I would say is being part of a community historically that has felt different levels of threat and the different extent to which they feel like they can be who they are or need to hide who they are, which is something the Jewish community has had to deal with. We don't want other communities to feel like they can't be who they are and can't be affirmed for who they are within Westwood, within our Commonwealth, within the country. So that's work that we value.
I was thinking a lot as you were talking about, we had talked about how we would love to kind of orchestrate some sort of sit down where you get the experience of someone else that is not part of who you are, where you could have a Jewish person and an African American person, and they could sit down and they can say, this is how I grew up, this is how I felt and under these situations, and here's how I felt in these situations. And if you don't have that conversation, then you really don't know. You had mentioned, hiding who you are as someone of Jewish faith, that kind of just is ingrained in you because of what we've experienced as a people. On a personal level, I remember being very young, probably like 5 or 6, and first hearing about the Holocaust and immediately thinking in my head, if someone knocks on my door, I'm immediately going to say that I'm not Jewish. Like that was part of my experience as a child. Like, and obviously I was born in the 80s, so therefore this could not have happened to me. But there's always this like worry that it could happen again, or it might happen to me, and I think that's something that, like, as a Jewish person, you live with, and I don't think a lot of other people understand that experience is how we, have felt. I don't know if you felt something like that too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think if you have an awareness as a child growing up in a diaspora community, even in the United States, which historically has been one of the most open communities where Jews have lived, though certainly not immune from anti-Semitism, you internalize that to an extent. And then, you reflect on the fact that, at least since the mid-1800s, the majority of the Jewish community in the United States has been of Eastern European descent and therefore of light skin. And certainly we know the history of race in this country. So Jews have also had the privilege, if they've wanted, to blend in or to hide as much as they want to an extent. So to sit down and have that conversation with an African American, an Asian American, to say, you can't hide those physical features that have often been the target of hatred, that's an interesting conversation. I also think that there's room for conversation around the nexus or the confluence of religion and ethnicity, because as Jews, we don't solely consider ourselves a religion. We consider ourselves as being part of a people, and certainly if you went to the state of Israel and saw the diversity of Jews there and skin color and sub-ethnicity, but that we belong to that Jewish people, that's also an interesting conversation. So I know I always feel it when I get to the demographic questions for the government, say, are you, white, African American, so forth? Well, yes, my skin color is light, but that doesn't reflect me culturally or ethnically, or even how I identify in terms of my heritage. So those are also interesting conversations to have.
I guess my last question that I had for you was, how would you suggest we bring people together to discuss hard topics?
I think you can't start discussing hard topics without a little bit of trust and without a little bit of understanding of where you are coming from, and probably also setting up some ground rules that you can agree on. So you might not agree on the topic itself, but can you agree to listen? Can you agree to acknowledge that your perspective is not the only perspective on an issue? And so I think if that groundwork is done, it can start those dialogues. And I think there's one other important piece that unfortunately is becoming increasingly countercultural, and that is you can debate ideas, you can disagree with ideas, but to attack someone personally, to use language that belittles someone, is not going to be effective, and it's going to be harmful. And unfortunately, both because of the type of communication that we find in the internet, increasingly news programs, increasingly our political discourse, and that the discourse that our leaders unfortunately model, we don't see that, and so it becomes harder to have those hard conversations rather than, and we just go to our little corner, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think my lens is always, fixed towards thinking about like youth, and youth programming. That's just the role that I'm in. But I think about, I wonder about two things. Like in this particular area, I wonder about, how you educate children, like along the way, about different like faiths, right? Because I'm thinking about that idea, kind of building off what you said, Rabbi Citrin, and thinking like, how do you start from like the earliest ages to have these conversations, with kids in a way, like something I was thinking about was, I have a 5-year-old and she came home around the Hindu holiday of Diwali, and they had made a little candle. I'm going to forget the name of it, but it was like a small candle. And she was talking about how Diwali celebrates light. And I was thinking, I'm going to try to figure out how to introduce the idea that, like, all religions celebrate, like, this idea of light in darker times. And that's something I had learned in college, like in a mixed theology philosophy class.
I was going to say, most of the times where you're exposed to these things are college classes.
Well, it had, like, opened my mind, like,
Yeah.
being raised in the Roman Catholic Church and, like, attending parochial school in my younger years. It was when I went to college was the first time that I was having these discussions. And so, you're a parent, you're trying to think about, like, how you're going to, like, get all these little, nuggets in. And I said, well, this is one example of, some light in a religion. And my daughter, who, again, was 5, she was like, yeah, all the religions have light, Mom. We talked about it. And I was like, awesome. And then I was like, awesome on so many levels. Awesome that somebody talked to you about that at school. Also awesome that you are 5. And
Yeah.
that is just
Now I don't have to send you to college,
Exactly.
right? I had to wait till college. I'm going to
the
save a lot of
savings I'm
money.
gonna
I know,
have.
that's right.
But I think it's funny, you're like, and that's what I would want to see, as much of as possible. Like, we've talked about this with other topics. It's like, if it's just an ongoing conversation that you have as you talk to your child, and as you teach them about the world around them. And I think that it just becomes natural, and that idea of othering it feels very unnatural, and foreign to them. Like, and I think that's just something I would want to think more about and talk more about. And I think, I'm curious, interested in how the task force, and groups like the Interfaith Council might go about, thinking about those types of things in Westwood. And the only other thing I was going to ask you, Micah, was you've talked before, and I think in a really beautiful way, about dignity. And you said something in one of our task force meetings about, it's really deciding, are you going to let the people in your community, like, are you going to allow them to live in dignity, and are you going to support them, like, living in dignity? And I just wondered, not that you can suddenly recall these awesome things you've said weeks before, but I don't know if that's something that you find yourself talking about often, or if you want to, kind of expound more on that. I just thought I think when you use that word dignity, it really gets at the heart of the matter, right?
I hope so. And I think sometimes sometimes what I hear in the dominant culture is, we're going to dismiss a conversation about acknowledging diversity, for example, because it's politically correct. And that's become jargon for a whole host of things. But I would hope that we have conversations about diversity and acknowledging others, because it's about embracing that idea of dignity, which at a very basic level is what I think human beings want and need to be acknowledged, and the fact that we could all be other at a certain point. It's very easy to be the other, even for those who are part of a dominant culture. And I think about, there was one of my favorite quotes is from a Lutheran pastor by the name of Martin Niemöller, who lived through Nazi Germany. And in fact, I was doing some reading about him, and when the Nazis came to power, he embraced the Nazi Party, which, remember, was elected democratically before it did away with with democracy in its
Right.
in its governing principles. And he, in fact, as he realized he was being surveilled by the Nazi government, started to speak out against the government, and he was sent to a concentration camp. But after the war, he would say, first they came for the communists, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. And then they came for the trade unionists, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So I think it's about what kind of world do we want to create? Do we want to take care of one another? Or do we see it basically as a world of division, me against you? So if we can focus on dignity, I think that needs can be met mutually. And that's not only in our one-on-one actions, it's also thinking about a society and thinking about systems in our society that need to be addressed because they haven't been paid attention to, and we're still feeling the effects of that, and ultimately not living up to what hopefully we can all agree on as Americans, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and to apply that as broadly as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, you left us with our quote today. I'm not going to overquote. Well, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast, episode 3. Tune in next time for our next episode.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.